What does it take to erase a town? Not just to damage it or to flood it, but to wipe it from the face of the earth, as if it never existed. What kind of force can bury 25,000 people in less than 3 minutes, silencing their songs, their prayers, and their screams under 50 feet of rock and ice? This is the story of a cataclysm so complete, so sudden, it turned a vibrant green valley into a barren gray moonscape. It's the story of an entire village that vanished in the blink of an eye. But it's also the story of how, in the midst of that total annihilation, in the deafening, dusty silence that followed, life, in its most fragile and innocent form, refused to be extinguished. May 31st, 1970, Yungay, Peru. If you could paint a picture of paradise, it would look like this. Nestled in a stunning valley in the Andes, Yungay was known as the Pearl of the Wayless Valley. It was a beautiful, bustling town of white adobe houses with red-tiled roofs. Its central plaza, the Plaza de Armas, was its beating heart, filled with meticulously trimmed palm trees and roses. At the center of the plaza stood a massive white cathedral, its bells ringing out over the valley. Above it all, towering 22,000 feet into the sky, was the peak of Nevado Huascaran, Peru's highest mountain. It was a guardian, a silent, snow-capped giant that brought tourists and gave the town its majestic, postcard-perfect beauty. The locals respected the mountain, but they did not fear it. It was simply ... There, it was a Sunday. The town was alive with a special, festive energy. It was 3:20 in the afternoon. Many of the town's children, over 300 of them, were gathered in the local stadium, which was set just outside the main town, to watch a traveling circus performance. Hundreds more were in the cathedral for the late afternoon mass, their voices echoing in the stone chapel. And almost everyone else was in the plaza or at home, excitedly preparing to listen to the opening match of the 1970 FIFA World Cup, which was about to be broadcast from Mexico. Peru's national team was playing, and the legendary Pelé would be leading Brazil. It was a perfect, peaceful Sunday, filled with the promise of joy. At 3:23 p.m., paradise broke. The ground began to shake. It wasn't a small tremor. It was the Great Peruvian Earthquake, a violent, magnitude 7.9 quake that ripped through the region. For 45 agonizing seconds, the earth heaved. The sound was a deafening roar as the very mountains seemed to groan. In Yungay, the white adobe walls of the houses cracked and collapsed. The beautiful cathedral shuddered. People screamed and ran into the streets, clinging to each other in terror. The dust was so thick, it choked the air, turning the bright afternoon sun a sickly, brownish, and then ... it stopped. The shaking was over. A stunned silence fell, broken only by the cries of the injured and the wailing of the terrified. People began to emerge from the dust to check on their loved ones. They had survived. It was a terrible earthquake, but they were alive. But the survivors who were in the streets, those who could see past the dust cloud, looked up. They looked up towards the silent giant, Huascaran, and they heard a sound they would later describe as the end of the world. It was not a rumble. It was a low, deep, guttural crack, followed by a sustained roar that sounded like 1,000 jets taking off at once. It was the sound of the mountain coming apart. The earthquake had destabilized the mountain's northern peak. An 80 million cubic meter slab of ice, rock, and glacier had sheared off 2 miles above them. This wasn't a snow avalanche. It was a debris flow, a liquid mountain, nearly 2 miles wide, falling through the sky. It hit the glacier below, vaporizing it, picking up millions of tons of mud, water, and boulders the size of houses. This wall of death began its 10-mile journey to Yungay. It was moving at over 200 miles per hour, faster than any car, faster than any human could run. It was a liquid bulldozer, 50 feet high, devouring everything in its path. The people of Yungay had 3 minutes. Most never even saw it coming. They were inside, pulling loved ones from the rubble of the earthquake. But the few who were outside, including the hundreds of people gathered in the town's stadium, looked up and saw it. A black, churning cloud shot through with ice, swallowing the sky. There was no time to pray, no time to escape. One man, a local bus driver, was seen running through the plaza, screaming, "Avalanche! Run! Run!" But run where? The avalanche hit the town with a force that defies imagination. The sound was a deafening, continuous explosion. The air blast alone, The wind pushed in front of the mudslide, leveled buildings before the debris even arrived. The wall of rock and ice hit the town and did not stop. It scoured Yungay from the map. It snapped the palm trees like twigs. It pulverized the white cathedral, silencing the 500 people inside. It buried the plaza, the market, the homes, and the 25,000 people within it, under an average of 50 feet of mud and rock. In 3 minutes, a town that had existed for centuries was gone. Silence. The roar of the mountain was replaced by a deafening, dusty quiet. Where a beautiful town had just been, there was now only a vast, gray, muddy plain. A new landscape, a tomb for 25,000 souls. The only thing that remained was the very top of the white cathedral and the tops of the 4 palm trees from the main plaza, poking through the mud like the masts of a sunken ship. But the entire village had not been buried. On a small hill, standing just above the town, was the local cemetery. At the moment of the quake, the circus performance in the stadium had just ended. About 300 children and adults, rather than going back down into the town, had decided to climb the hill to the cemetery, which offered a panoramic view of the valley. They were on high ground. They and a handful of others who had managed to sprint up that hill in those final chaotic moments were the only survivors. They were not saved, they were spared. They were forced to be the witnesses. They stood there, covered in dust, clutching each other, watching and stunned. Silent horror as their homes, their parents, their brothers, their sisters, their entire world vanished beneath a sea of mud. Their survival was its own kind of hell. They were now 300 orphans and widows, standing in a graveyard, the only living souls in a valley of the dead. For days, the survivors huddled on their island of high ground, surrounded by a sea of gray, hardening mud. Rescuers from around the world began to arrive by helicopter, but it was not a rescue mission. It was a recovery mission. There was nothing to dig for, there was no one to save. The town of Yungay was declared a national cemetery, a place too sacred and too horrible to disturb. The 25,000 victims would be left where they fell, under a 50-foot thick shroud of earth. The rescuers and survivors walked the vast gray moonscape, calling out names, their voices swallowed by the emptiness. There was no response. The silence was absolute. And then, days later, one of the rescue teams thought they heard something. A faint, impossible sound. A cry. They dismissed it. It was a bird. It was the wind. It was their minds playing tricks on them, a symptom of the overwhelming grief. But they heard it again. A thin, weak wail. It was unmistakable. It was a baby. They followed the sound, scrambling over the sharp debris and the hardening, cement-like mud. It was coming from a pile of rubble that had once been a house near the edge of the debris field. They began to dig frantically with their bare hands. They moved rocks, twisted rebar. The crying grew louder, a beacon of life in this valley of death. And then they saw it. Wedged in a small pocket of air, protected by a fallen roof beam that had taken the brunt of the impact, was a wooden crib. And inside that crib, covered in dust, but miraculously, impossibly, alive, was a baby girl. They lifted her out. She was dehydrated, she was terrified, but she was unharmed. In a disaster that had killed 25,000 people, including almost certainly her entire family, this one tiny sleeping child had survived. The avalanche had buried the entire village. It had leveled the cathedral, crushed the stadium, and silenced a generation. But in its blind, chaotic rage, it had, by some statistical miracle, spared the most vulnerable life of all. The discovery of the baby was a symbol. For the 300 survivors standing on the cemetery hill, their lives were over. They had lost everything. They were ghosts, left behind by their own town. But the image of that child, pulled alive from a tomb, gave them a reason. It was the ultimate defiant act of life. The mountain could take their town, it could take their families, but it could not extinguish the future. The baby of Yungay became a legend, a single point of light in an ocean of darkness, a testament to the fact that even when an entire world is buried, hope, can be found in a crib.